Hi, my name is Jacob Kramer, and this is my presentation on Apollo GraphQL. So we'll go ahead and get right into it. So I wanted to provide a little bit of history about Apollo GraphQL. So it was created by Facebook in 2002. Now the goal of Apollo GraphQL was that they wanted a better data fetching solution so that they can use it across all of the company's products and services. What they wanted was a next generation data system, which basically worked with any backend or any database or any API. They internally used it until they open sourced it in 2015. It started as Apollo, and then they decided to use GraphQL as the query language for it. It was designed to be developer friendly so that anyone who sees it, even non-technical people, could understand what the queries meant. And I'll get to that in a little bit as well. So there is a difference between Apollo and GraphQL. So Apollo is the API itself. Apollo makes it easy to program with GraphQL. In fact, Apollo implements the GraphQL. It has full stack support through its different software. So it has Apollo Client, Apollo Server, and Engine, and you can use all three in your development stack, or you can choose only a couple. Because GraphQL is actually data source agnostic. I'm going to start with that point because GraphQL does not rely on Apollo. Apollo is what uses GraphQL, but GraphQL itself is just the querying language. So the way it's defined is through these things called schemas, and these are defined in the server, and it defines how the data is shaped. So Apollo leverages GraphQL, while GraphQL is the querying language. So the different Apollo frameworks, we have Apollo Client. So the client is a state management library. The word state comes from front-end development, where we use state and we update it asynchronously so that we can display data to a customer or to a user. So the management has to do with just asynchronous data management, which is what the client is good at. It supports frameworks like React, React Native, Angular, native iOS, and native Android languages. And particularly with React, I know Apollo Client's hook leverages React's hook API. So it can bind a query to a component, which is pretty neat. It also fetches, caches, and modifies application data in your backend. So really useful tool there. So the Apollo engine is a hosted infrastructure. What this is it's like a tool, a middleware tool that is used basically as like a monitoring and also optimization tool. So it has features like caching, performance tracing, and error tracking. So particularly with caching, this can be used to minimize page render times. Error tracking is pretty self-explanatory. You can diagnose service errors that occur in your application. With performance tracing, or also called execution tracing sometimes, you can trace your GraphQL operations, your queries, and you can get details about execution times and things like that. And there's also something called schema analysis. So you can, when you define a schema, this tool can help you determine how much data is being used when you create a schema. And then you also have Apollo server. So this actually is the server end, and it defines the query schemas. So the schemas are actually the touch points of your front end. They are defined using a schema definition language. And schemas just represent how your app works with the data that it needs. And so that's why we say that it describes the shape of our data. So yeah, the shape of our data is like basically how the data relates to each other. And it also defines how the front end will fetch what our client needs from our data source. So major features of GraphQL. So first of all, it prevents overfetching. All of this has to do with the fact that it is strongly typed, and I'll get to that in a second. So overfetching is just asking for more data than you need. So I've definitely experienced in REST API usage where I would query an entire item when really I just needed maybe like a field of it. Prevents underfetching. So this is the complete opposite and not getting all the data that you need. So what I mean by it being strongly typed is that it's just a more stable. It's like a more stable API. It has fewer bugs in development, and it has the possibility of introducing more intelligent tooling. And then it's also graphical. A lot of sources use the word declarative, which just means that it's very defining and hierarchical, my bad. So it's actually very easy to read. There's also a feature called GraphQL versioning. I guess it's not really a feature, but what it is it's just an easier way that you can add deprecation hints. So when you add, remove, or when you change fields in your existing graph, and then GraphQL, the biggest feature of them all is that it decouples your client from your server, which is the whole point of it. So in GraphQL, you have your queries and you have your mutations. Pretty simply, your queries are used to fetch data, and they are synonymous with get calls in REST API. And then mutations are used when you want to invoke a change in the system, and these are essentially the same as your REST API's post and delete methods. And as far as how it accesses or changes those data, remember, GraphQL is data agnostic, so it does not matter where the data comes from. It could be from any database. It can be from a microservice, or it can even be from a RESTful API, actually. So you can really combine different frameworks and have a very diverse development stack using GraphQL. Some examples of this in real life are obviously Facebook. Facebook created it, and it is not the only social media that has begun to use it. There is Twitter and Instagram as well. My experience using GraphQL is I had to create a chat app and messaging service with it, so I know it can be used for that. And then it was also used in Shopify and a couple of other notable services such as Netflix, Walmart, New York Times' website, Glassdoor, and a couple of those. So it's a pretty popular framework and API. So in summary, Apollo is a robust API that leverages the query language GraphQL to communicate between different parts of the stack. Apollo not only uses, but through its Apollo engine. It could even optimize GraphQL. It just makes it easier to program with GraphQL. While GraphQL itself can be used independently with other services and API. But it's very typical that people will use Apollo to program with GraphQL. All right, well, thank you. And this was my presentation on Apollo GraphQL. Yeah, so thank you and see ya.